What if a simple decision or moment of duty performed with unexpected grace was not just seen, but carefully weighed as the deciding factor in a drama of immense hidden wealth? This question hovered unknown and unacknowledged over the life of John Johnson, a man for whom duty and exhaustion were two sides of the same tarnished coin. At 32 years old, John was a 6-year veteran of the New York City Fire Department, FT, based out of Engine Company 27. His life was structured by the 24-hour shift cycle, punctuated by the shrill, demanding clang of the alarm and the quiet, persistent grind of student loans. He hadn't fully escaped from his brief, aborted attempt at college. He rented a small, perpetually drafty apartment in Astoria, Queens, and supplemented his income working private security gigs, often catching only 4 or 5 hours of fragmented sleep at a time. The weight he carried wasn't just a 50-pound pack of gear. It was the financial burden of a city that never stopped demanding payment. His setting was the Crossroads Coffee and Bagel, a humble, independently owned shop situated on a busy corner in Midtown, directly across from the corporate monolith of the Sterling Tower, a building that housed some of the most exclusive financial firms on the eastern seaboard. The Crossroads was John's usual stop-off point after his 7 a.m. shift ended, a place where the scent of burnt sugar and dark roast was a comforting antidote to the metallic temps of smoke and sweat. He knew the owner, old Mr. Costa, who always had a large black coffee ready before John even reached the counter. The vinyl booths were cracked, the counter chipped, and the clientele were a reliable mix of blue-collar workers finishing their night shifts and junior analysts starting their punishing days. Among the regulars, one figure became a persistent presence: Elizabeth Jones. Elizabeth, around 38 years old, was unmistakable. She was visibly and heavily pregnant, already past her 9th month, moving with a cautious, deliberate slowness that spoke of immense physical discomfort. Her fashion was muted but expensive, cashmere and soft flowing silk that seemed to absorb the diner's harsh fluorescent light. She never looked anyone in the eye, and she always took the same corner table by the window that offered a discreet view of the Sterling Tower's imposing glass facade. Her order never changed: a plain toasted bagel with cream cheese and a single cup of herbal tea. Elizabeth wasn't cold. She was simply encased in an aura of profound, almost overwhelming private misery. She looked like a marble statue carved by grief. The staff at the Crossroads, hardened by years of dealing with entitled Midtown commuters, generally left her alone. They saw the expensive clothes and the guarded expression and assumed she was another difficult woman used to being waited on. Mr. Costa, sympathetic but pragmatic, told John, "Just get her the tea fast, son." John, however, saw beyond the expensive fabric and the reserved demeanor. He saw the way she clutched the back of the booth before sitting the sharp intake of breath she couldn't quite suppress when she shifted her weight, and the almost impossible distance between her car, a sleek dark sedan with tinted windows that always double-parked illegally, and her table. He saw struggle, magnified by the vulnerability of her condition. Their daily interaction began not out of intention, but out of necessity. On an exceptionally icy Thursday morning in mid-February, the sidewalk outside the Crossroads was slick with black ice. John, coming off a brutal shift that had involved a 3-alarm fire in a tenement building, was still wired with adrenaline. He was waiting for his coffee when he saw Elizabeth try to get out of the sedan. She braced a hand against the roof, but her large, round belly made balance precarious. Her foot slipped on the ice, and a gasp, pure and terrified, escaped her lips. John didn't hesitate. He dropped his duffel bag, crossed the street in 3 long strides, and reached her just as she began to fall. He stabilized her with a strong, gentle hand on her elbow, guiding her slowly and deliberately to the coffee shop door. "Easy, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, worn soft by smoke and fatigue. "Take it slow." She didn't thank him. She barely looked at him. Her eyes, a striking, deep shade of green, were wide with lingering fear and a strange, deep-seated resentment, as if his help was an unwelcome intrusion. She pulled her arm away quickly once they were inside, yet the small, almost imperceptible gesture, the way her breath finally left her lungs when her feet found the linoleum, told him everything. He simply retrieved his coffee and left, dismissing the incident as a routine. But the next morning, and the morning after that, Elizabeth's car arrived, and John was there waiting for his coffee. He didn't ask her, he didn't offer loudly, and he never made a show of it. He simply waited until her car pulled up, walked across the street, and offered her his arm, supporting her carefully across the treacherous few yards of sidewalk. She continued to accept his help with a stiff, almost rigid silence, a brief nod being the absolute limit of her acknowledgement. To the casual observer, it looked like a private security detail, not a random act of compassion from a weary firefighter in soot-stained boots and a worn FDNY jacket. John never expected a word of thanks, let alone a tip. He was doing it because she was in need, and to him, need was the only currency that mattered. He remembered his own mother struggling through her pregnancies alone, and he saw a flicker of that same isolated fortitude in Elizabeth. For over 8 weeks, the ritual continued. John would come off shift, walk her across the street, and go get his coffee. Sometimes he'd talk to Mr. Costa about the state of the Mets, or complain about the new safety protocols, filling the silence of his life with small, mundane details. Elizabeth, across the room, remained an elegant, silent as John often wondered about her, about the story behind the luxury and the loneliness, but he never asked. His job had taught him that everyone carries a concealed trauma, and that the greatest act of respect is often simply to stand guard over their silence. Then, at the start of April, the pattern broke. John came out of the engine house, his coffee craving already a physical ache, and the black sedan was missing. Boothford by the window was empty. He felt a small, unfamiliar pang of worry. She was so close to her due date. He convinced himself she'd finally had the baby and was safely at home. He told himself he was relieved that his small, extra duty was done. He got his coffee and sat down, feeling the sudden, empty space in his routine. The bell above the door jingled at 7:48 a.m., announcing an arrival that instantly froze the usual hustle of the Crossroads coffee and bagel. It wasn't the usual rush of stressed-out commuters, but towering men dressed in identical, severe charcoal suits, with the rigid bearing of professional security, entered the shop. Their movements were coordinated, their gaze clinical, and they exuded an intimidating, alien power that didn't belong amidst the chipped formica and the smell of roasting beans. They were followed by a fifth person, Ms. Sight_Start Cynthia Ramirez, a woman in her late 40s, impeccably tailored in a pale gray suit, with a severe blonde bob and a face that spoke of decades spent commanding respect. She carried a slim, expensive leather portfolio. The entire shop went silent. John, halfway through a bite of a poppy seed bagel, paused, the food suddenly tasteless in his mouth. Ms. Ramirez scanned the room with a laser-like intensity, her gaze dismissing the cashier, the cooks, and finally landing on John, the only man in the room, still wearing the visible emblem of a hard life-to-worn FDNY jacket and the tired, determined eyes. She walked directly toward him, her footsteps making a precise, rhythmic clip on the floor. Her bodyguards spread out slightly, creating an invisible, protective wall around her. "Are you?" Ms. Ramirez asked, her voice a polished, precise instrument that cut through the silence. John swallowed the bagel. "That's me. What can I do for you, ma'am?" "I am Cynthia Ramirez, senior counsel for the firm of Blackwood and Finch," she announced, her eyes taking in the soot on his jacket. "I was the personal attorney for Ms. Elizabeth Jones." The air in the diner seemed to crackle. Elizabeth, a terrifying, icy knot formed in John's stomach. "Is she... Ms. Ramirez's expression softened slightly. A brief, almost professional moment of human empathy. Ms. Jones passed away unexpectedly, but peacefully, late yesterday evening. Shortly after delivering a healthy baby girl, John felt the weight of the coffee cup in his hand become suddenly unbearable. The thought of that quiet, intensely guarded woman who had been so close to her moment of relief, now gone, leaving behind a baby who would never know her touch, hit him with the force of a falling wall. He looked up at the corporate lawyer and the stone-faced security detail, realizing the quiet struggle he had witnessed had ended in tragedy. I am so sorry," he managed, his voice hoarse. "I barely knew her." Ms. Ramirez nodded, the movement barely perceptible. That single, seemingly small act, Mr. Johnson, was enough. Ms. Jones was a very specific woman who acted with immense foresight. She was quite clear about your identity and your purpose here. John stared at the lawyer, bewildered, then at his soot-stained jacket, feeling the bizarre, terrifying shift of the ground beneath him. He was a firefighter. He ran into danger. He didn't ride in black cars to law offices and gleaming towers to hear the final wishes of Women he only knew by their daily struggle and their silent nod. The world, which had always seemed so clearly divided into the burning and the safe, was suddenly impossibly blurred. The drive to the Blackwood and Finch offices was a silent, absurd journey. John, cramped in the back of the plush black Mercedes, felt the expensive leather seats mocking his worn denim and the persistent smell of residual smoke clinging to his coat. Ms. Ramirez sat beside him, reviewing documents with a practiced, detached efficiency. The streets of Manhattan, which John knew intimately from the dizzying, sirens-blaring view out of a truck cab, now looked flat, distant, and uncaring through the tinted glass of the luxury vehicle. His mind was a chaotic tumble of grief for Elizabeth and dizzying confusion about his own situation. What could a silent, profoundly wealthy woman leave to a blue-collar civil servant? A thank you note, a few $1,000s. The thought felt both insulting and deeply humbling. He would have walked her across that ice 1,000 times for free. The law offices were situated on the 41st floor of the Sterling Tower, a fortress of steel and glass where every surface gleamed with polished, unattainably expensive. The lobby was hushed, floored in granite, and filled with abstract sculptures that looked like frozen screams. John felt acutely like an imposter, a piece of industrial equipment dragged into an art museum. He was led into a massive, cavernous conference room. The atmosphere was one of palpable, icy hostility, a feeling that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the two people. Already seated at the 20-foot-long mahogany table, they were Mr. Sight_Start Robert Williams, an impeccably dressed man with the aggressively confident posture of old money Sichi, Trey Sichi Starts, and his son, Matthew Gonzalez, a younger, softer version of his father, sporting an air of petulant impatience. Sight 3. They radiated an angry, possessive entitlement. Robert Williams looked at John's FDNY jacket and his tired face, and a cold sneer curled his lip. Robert demanded, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. Ms. Ramirez, unflappable, remained professional. Mr. Williams, this is Mr. John Johnson. He is a key beneficiary and is required to be present. Mr. Johnson, this is Ms. Matthew, let out a theatrical, exasperated sigh. A firefighter. Really, even in death, Elizabeth had to be melodramatic. Get on with it, Cynthia. John slid into a chair at the far end of the table, feeling the weight of their combined contempt. Ms. Ramirez began the reading, her voice a steady, dry drone, outlining a vast, intricate fortune managed through a complex network of holdings and offshore trusts. The numbers she cited were astronomical, figures that existed only on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. John learned that Elizabeth was not merely rich. She was the sole, fiercely protected heiress to the Williams Global Infrastructure Group, an empire of utility companies, transportation networks, and real estate valued in the billions. Robert Williams, her father, was the company's ruthless, manipulative chairman who had cut Elizabeth out of the active company affairs years ago after a bitter falling out. Ms. Ramirez detailed the standard substantial amounts to charities, seven-figure sums to various foundation boards. Then she paused, looking directly at the Williamses. Robert erupted, slamming his fist on the table. $3 million. That's an insult. The company's worth $35 billion. That's less than a rounding error. Where is the controlling interest? Ms. Ramirez remained icy calm. Ms. Jones restructured the majority of her personal assets in the final months of her life. Mr. Williams, her will is meticulous and fully executed. Robert was shaken with impotent fury. But Ms. Ramirez continued, her voice gaining a sharp, deliberate clarity as she reached the final provision. And now we come to the final and largest component of Ms. Jones's estate. To Mr. the Air Fractured. John's heart stopped. He felt a ringing silence in his ears. The Jones Family Trust, Ms. Ramirez stated, her eyes narrowed in warning at the Williamses, comprises the entirety of Elizabeth Jones's unencumbered personal wealth, which includes her portfolio of publicly traded equities, bonds, private holdings, and the controlling 65% interest in the Midtown Transit Authority, MT, subsidiary known as The Hub, the largest private real estate development in Midtown. Matthew Gonzalez made a strang-led choking sound. Robert Williams, whose face had gone from red to an astonishing, terrifying shade of white, lunged forward, grasping the table edge. This is insane. contested. She was clearly not of sound mind. "Mr. Williams, please restrain yourself," Ms. Ramirez commanded, her security detail taking a subtle step forward. Ms. Jones's medical records and her numerous psychological evaluations confirmed she was of sound mind. Furthermore, she provided explicit justification in the will, stating that Mr. Johnson offered her the only moment of genuine, uncompensated human grace she had experienced in the entirety of her pregnancy. John could only stare. The numbers, the reality of the obscene, impossible figure of $750 million, simply refusing to integrate into his brain. He was still a guy with 5 hours of sleep and 5 figures of student debt. This was a cosmic joke, a cruelty designed to expose the absurdity of his life. Ms. Ramirez then addressed John directly, handing him a sealed envelope and a key. "There is one final matter, Mr. Johnson. Elizabeth wished for you to have access to her private study." As John was escorted out of the 41st floor, Robert Williams's voice, raw and poisonous, followed him down the hallway. "You won't keep a dime of that, Johnson. We will bury you in litigation." The shock was a heavy, suffocating blanket. John, the weary firefighter, had just inherited an unimaginable fortune, and simultaneously, a venomous Al-Consumi family war with the ruthless architects of New York's corporate power. He felt no triumph, only a crippling sense of terror. He didn't want the money. He wanted his routine back, his simple duty, his life where the only danger was fire, not corporate greed. The key in John's hand, heavy and old-fashioned, felt more substantial than the $790 million. Mr. Davies, Elizabeth's legal representative, drove John in a private, unmarked vehicle to a discreet pre-war building on the Upper East Side, a place of silent, almost menacing wealth. He guided John through hushed, marble-tiled hallways, explaining that Elizabeth, in her final months, had deliberately separated herself from her family and corporate life. This, Davies explained, gesturing to the opulent, yet completely impersonal apartment, was not her home. The apartment was a gallery of expensive, joyless art and furniture. The study, however, was different. John inserted the key into the heavy, dark wood door, and it turned with a decisive, final click. Stepping inside, he found warmth, the faint scent of dried lavender, and a lifetime's worth of secrets. The room was messy, lived in, and organized not by corporate logic, but by emotional necessity. Bookshelves overflowed with everything from classic literature to urban planning texts, but it was the wall behind the desk that drew his entire focus. A massive corkboard, meticulously organized with photographs, legal documents, stock reports, and handwritten notes, all connected by colored strings. It was the strategic map of a profoundly unhappy genius. At the center of the web was a photograph, a radiant young woman, perhaps Elizabeth in her early 20s, laughing wildly while building a small, dilapidated playground structure in a community garden. Next to it, John saw the name Jones Community Development Initiative and a series of yellowed, bitter newspaper clippings. The clippings told a story of a fierce, idealistic battle. Elizabeth had used her inheritance to fund affordable housing projects and community centers, directly opposing her father Robert's predatory real estate schemes. Robert Williams, driven only by profit, had systematically dismantled her efforts, crushing her projects and forcing her to retreat. One handwritten note from Elizabeth read, "They only saw value in what could be sold." John then traced the connections to Robert and Matthew. The lines were almost all red, indicating financial manipulation and ruin. There were reports detailing Matthew's massive gambling debts, which Robert was forced to silently cover to protect the family name. There were memos showing how Robert had coerced Elizabeth into stepping away from the Midtown Transit Authority MT Hub project, an immense, politically sensitive real estate holding, intending to bleed its assets dry through complex shell companies. Elizabeth had seen his plan and had secretly transferred the controlling interest into the Jones Family Trust. Before her death, the same trust she had just bequeathed to John. It wasn't about him being a firefighter. It was about her test. Elizabeth had been looking for Integrity's soul that operated outside the logic of acquisition. John's quiet, uncompensated help, his refusal to seek acknowledgement, was the character witness she had desperately needed. She hadn't chosen him to reward him. She had chosen him to be the steward of her life's work and the final, righteous obstacle to her father's greed. He opened the final sealed envelope. Inside was a letter and a single, crisp proxy card for the upcoming Williams Global shareholder meeting. The letter was written in Elizabeth's elegant, precise hand. Mr. Johnson, if you are reading this, you are the last defender of the Jones legacy. My father will try to seize control of the board next month to liquidate the Hub project and bury my community initiatives. He thinks you are SLE bought or SLE crushed. You are not. This proxy card gives you the right to speak. Everything you need to defeat him is on this wall. The money is yours, but the fight belongs to my daughter. And now, to you. John closed his eyes, the gravity of his inheritance finally hitting him. He wasn't just rich. He was the key player in a multi-billion-dollar corporate war, armed with a dead woman of secrets and an armored division of lawyers who had worked for her. The subsequent weeks were a frenetic blur. John maintained his shifts at the FDNY, but his nights were spent in Elizabeth's study. Guided by Mr. Davies, he devoured the documents, learning the complex language of corporate governance, leveraged buyouts, and proxy fights. He learned that Robert Williams's plan was to call for a vote of no confidence in the current COO woman. Elizabeth had trusted Dan use his allies on the board to install his own puppet chairman, thus enabling the liquidation of the Hub. John's primary weapon was not his stock, which, while controlling, was not yet fully settled, but the detailed, irrefutable evidence of Robert and Matthew's fraudulent financial misconduct that Elizabeth had secretly compiled. The day of the shareholder meeting arrived. John, dressed in an impeccably tailored, sober suit supplied by Davies' firm, walked into the Williams Global Tower with the two most formidable bodyguards Davies could hire. He was still a firefighter, but today he was also a corporate avatar of justice. In the vast, tiered boardroom, Robert Williams and Matthew Gonzalez were radiating arrogant confidence, working the room, securing their votes. Robert spotted John and approached his expression a mask of venomous condescension. "Look at this. Firefighter John Johnson, I'm prepared to offer you $60 million cash to sign away your share of the trust. $60 million is more than you'd earn in 5 lifetimes. Take it and walk away." John met his gaze, his voice steady despite the hammer blow of his heart. "I won't be selling anything, Mr. Williams. I'm here to represent Ms." The meeting proceeded. Robert delivered a practiced, polished speech, decrying the current leadership as stagnant and incapable, and called for the no-confidence vote. The momentum was clearly with him. The chairman asked Jones stood up. The room, filled with high-powered analysts and investors, fell into stunned silence.